So the Prime Minister has delayed the election, we know that, because of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred. And I heard a lot of analysts saying, well, this could really work against the government. But Peter Dutton has actually really been struggling too.
Yeah, look, I think you can read the tea leaves lots of different ways. The polls do seem to be slightly tending in the government's favour, but only a bit. And with the number of undecided voters we have at the moment, I wouldn't read too much into that. Maybe Anthony Albanese's been a bit more on his game, but also I think the thing that's happening is Peter Dutton's agenda is starting to get some real scrutiny, and it's sort of not standing up to that scrutiny in many respects. He's got sort of big, broad policies. There's not a lot of detail to scrutinise yet, but when you get into some of those policies that are on the table, there's inconsistencies, they keep changing their minds. And it's starting to sort of bubble over into the party as well. So Peter Dutton has led this really unified coalition for the duration of this term, which has been one of his great strengths. And now there's questions coming up from some of his colleagues about should they have more substantive policy on the table. Now, in a way, this always happens at this point in the cycle. We always say oppositions need to give us more policies, and oppositions always say, we'll tell you in the election when people are listening, which is precisely what Peter Dutton said on Thursday. But I do think you're right, there's this slight shift where the scrutiny is coming on Peter Dutton and he's struggling just a little bit under that spotlight.
I think Peter Dutton's had a particularly good run, you would say, as an opposition leader, and has avoided scrutiny more than your average opposition leader. Like, consider the fact that he barely did press conferences in Canberra in front of the press gallery for years. You know, he favoured popping up in sort of more remote locations with smaller press packs, doing his kind of fireside chats on 2GB or with friendly media. You can't really do that the closer you get to an election campaign. We're also seeing greater scrutiny of things like his property interest, shares that he's bought, his travel, his expenses, those sorts of things. So I think that just reflects where we are in the election cycle and the fact that some of that media strategy that he's had until now can't carry you all the way through to an election.
But he's also been on a good run in the sense that he's been pretty effective as an opposition leader since the Voice referendum. You know, his strategy during the referendum and subsequently a pretty negative one. You know, portraying himself as strong and the government Albanese as weak, essentially. Just attacking rather than putting forward alternative policies, as oppositions often do, but kind of there's a playbook that goes back to Tony Abbott, if not before, and he's done that well. He's effective in that. He speaks in relatively clear sentences, which is not something you can always say for the Prime Minister.
We're setting the bar pretty low there.
He doesn't waffle.
True.
Short, sharp answers.
Exactly. To a point that gets you quite a long way, but it doesn't necessarily cut it during an election campaign when you actually have to come up with your own policies, as we will discuss.
We will get to more of these policy issues that the coalition is facing, but you're right, Peter Dutton has appeared really strong. And then there was the cyclone, and he talked about the Prime Minister calling an election would be demonstrating a tin ear, and then he went off to a Harbourside Mansion fundraiser.
He flew from Brisbane to Sydney to go to a fundraiser at the Harbourside Mansion of Justin Hems, the Sydney hospitality guy, while still talking about the cyclone in radio interviews and so on. And
not mentioning he was in Sydney.
Not mentioning he was in Sydney. Queensland obviously is his home state. His electorate is just outside, on the outskirts of Brisbane. You would expect him to be like filling sandbags and making a point of being close to the people who are being affected by the cyclone. And so that was talking of tin ears, that was a terrible look.
And I think it meant that when that came out in the Financial Review, it meant he then didn't do press for several days during the cyclone when Anthony Albanese was being prime ministerial and doing what prime ministers need to do in disasters. I'm assuming, I don't know, but I'm assuming because he didn't want to get asked about that in that circumstance when viewership of television programs was at its height because people were so concerned about the disaster. So it sort of made it more difficult for him to react to the disaster.
And that's the kind of thing that really does stick in people's memories, I think. It's not just a crisis that the opposition leader can't do anything very much practical. It's like moral support.
Well,
I'm
but
here.
Scott,
I'm
Scott
supporting
Morrison
you.
couldn't actually hold
Exactly.
a hose.
He
and it
literally
still made
couldn't hold a hose,
yeah?
but saying it it was an absolute catastrophe for him. So, yeah, it was a really inexplicable own goal, really, except they need the money for the election.
Yeah.
I guess they want the fundraising looms large in their thinking at the moment.
And one that his political opponents made hay from very quickly. I saw some of the Teal candidates who are running up in that part of Australia were pointing out that, posting pictures of them filling sandbags and checking on their neighbours, saying, meanwhile, Dutton's flying off to Sydney, this is what we're doing. It wasn't a great look.
There was also the Sydney caravan plot, Jo, and that seemed to initially be this quite effective attack from Dutton against Albanese. He was using it, but the tables perhaps have turned on that.
Yeah, that's right. So this has been an incredibly effective line of attack for Dutton over the summer, particularly playing into his broader narrative about the strong leadership he can offer compared to what he describes as the weak leadership that Anthony Albanese presents Australia with. So back in January, this caravan packed with explosives was found on Sydney's northwest fringe, obviously causing huge shock and concern, a huge story. A lot of politicians were quick to jump on this and label it a terrorist incident or a potential terrorist incident. Chris Minns, the New South Wales Premier, Anthony Albanese did. But I think it's fair to say that nobody played the politics of that situation harder than Peter Dutton. He was out there calling for a national inquiry. He was calling Anthony Albanese's fitness as a leader in a moment of, national security crisis into question. He kept repeating that this could have been Australia's worst terrorist attack ever. He went really, really hard on that. It was revealed this week that rather than being a terror plot, the caravan was in fact part of an elaborate ploy by organised crime figures to basically to create leverage in other cases. And police have also alleged that organised crime is behind a wave of anti-Semitic attacks across Sydney as part of an effort to distract police resources. So Peter Dutton's kind of line of attack on the anti-Semitism crisis and national security has started to fall apart a little bit, I guess.
But I mean, the police were saying from quite early on that they had doubts. They weren't being definitive, but they were saying they had doubts. And Peter Dutton didn't moderate his attack at all at that point. He kept calling it a potential mass casualty event and really attacking the Prime Minister. And I guess the thing that, really struck me was, from the point of view of the Jewish community in Sydney, it's still terrifying. Like this whole argument doesn't make it any less terrifying. But having the opposition leader really ramp up the idea that it was a potential imminent mass casualty event when in fact, facts now tell us it wasn't, probably made their concerns and fears worse, I would imagine.
Yeah. And so this has really gone from an issue where he was really on the front foot and putting the Prime Minister in the frame to an issue where he's now in the frame too. Like, what does this say about his judgment in a time of crisis? What does this say about his ability to sort of be cautious and circumspect and seek out appropriate facts and to behave in a way that doesn't inflame community fears and tensions? And, I've noticed Labor's really running a line this week calling Dutton reckless. Like, this is something that they obviously want to put in people's minds, that this man cannot necessarily be trusted in times of crisis. And that's a real turnaround from where the conversation on national security has been over the summer.
So complicated perception issues, but as you've already mentioned, there's policy issues as well. A few examples where there have been inconsistencies. Why can't they get their story straight on that?
Good question. One of the most recent examples was about insurance. Now, obviously, Peter Dutton wants to tap into the very justifiable anger around Australia from people who've been in the path of natural disasters and who can't get insurance or who can't get affordable insurance. I get that. However, his line is, it's a market failure and therefore they will consider divestiture in the same way as they're considering for supermarkets and for hardware stores like Bunnings. But then the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, and other frontbenchers would say, no, that's not their policy. And then Peter Dutton would say, yes, it is their policy. There was a story in the Nine papers this week that said it was in their speaking notes that they would not have divestiture for insurance companies, and then that disappeared. It's not actually clear what their policy is. The Nationals are saying, well, it didn't go to the party room, so they don't know what the policy is. And as well as that confusion and internal, disarray, I think the actual policy as put forward by Dutton, if you believe that's the policy, doesn't actually make sense, because it's implying that the concentration of ownership in the insurance industries is the cause of the rising premiums. I mean, there is some concentration of ownership. There's sort of 4 big companies, but according to most experts and a parliamentary inquiry, there are much bigger reasons for the rises in premiums, including more extreme weather events because of global heating, growing asset values in high-risk areas, i.e. we're building houses on floodplains and in bushland, and higher inflation and rising global reinsurance premiums. And so I feel like he's latching onto a problem with a kind of not thought through solution. And I thought it was really interesting in that report I referred to, his own senators, so the Liberal senators David Sharma and Andrew McLaughlin, wrote additional notes in that report which said, while Liberal senators recognise that in many cases insurance premiums have been rising and rising fast, there is not the evidence to support wholesale interventions in the insurance market. At a macro level, the insurance market continues to function as it should. So the people in his party who've looked into this policy in detail say it's not the problem with the market, which would suggest divestiture is not the solution. But it's a good talking point on radio, and that's what he's saying. So when it comes under scrutiny, A, it's disarray, and B, even if you think what Peter Dutton's saying is the policy, it doesn't really hold water.
But it's not just insurance. Public service cuts, the business lunch policy, there are other examples too.
Well, we've discussed public servants on this podcast before, and, it's all over the place. Sometimes it's 36,000 jobs, sometimes it's just natural attrition or hardly any. The coalition says they're all going to be in Canberra and no services will be affected, but then the government points out that most of the jobs that have been added in the public service are not in Canberra, they're in the regions and are delivering services like disability insurance or the like. So I think that's a good example of a policy which just changes depending on who you're asking.
Yes, and earlier this year, the Coalition announced their policy called the Meals and Entertainment Policy. This is the plan to allow $20,000 in tax deductions for business dining expenses. Not perhaps particularly a popular policy among the wider electorate so far, but they got into confusion about whether it was in fact meals and entertainment or just meals, and it turned out the entertainment part was not going to be in the policy, but it was only after they talked about it at some length initially.
I think people started asking about adult entertainment and stuff, and got it all.
Golf days and stuff, yeah. So that, regardless of the merits or otherwise of the actual policy, just what it applied to became a point of confusion among coalition spokespeople.
Which presumably you should know.
You would think they would have sorted out before they put it out, yeah.
But there's also nuclear power. That's a big headline policy. Have we got clarity on that one? Is that a nice, sharp idea from them?
Look, to be fair, there is more details around that policy. They've talked about where they want to build nuclear reactors. They've put out some cost modelling, but I do think they misrepresent the cost modelling. They talk about it meaning there'll be a 44% reduction in power prices in the near term, in the 10 years or so that they say it will take to build nuclear reactors. Actually, the modelling was looking much further out about that and wasn't talking about retail prices at all. And the other thing where there's confusion, I think, in the nuclear policy is around what say those local areas would have in the reactors being built. So initially it was, well, there'll be 2.5 years consultation and you'll have lots of say. And then it was, but you won't have a veto. And then the Nationals leader said, actually, we're going to start building from day one. So I don't know, if I lived in one of those areas, I would want a little bit more clarity on that.
So you've painted a picture of multiple policies where there's confusion, but how is that possible? Isn't there supposed to be, party discipline? Aren't they supposed to get into a room and sort all of this out?
Well, theoretically, yes. And certainly from here on in, with the scrutiny of an election campaign, that will definitely be the case. So Peter Dutton is going to give a budget speech in reply on the Thursday, so on the 27th of March, and we all anticipate that the election will be called soon after that. We're assuming there will be policies, like some of the bigger, meatier policies in that. I cannot recall a policy released in a budget speech in reply that hasn't got some attempt at costing attached to it over the next 4 years or the duration of the policy. So the expectation will certainly be that policies that come out from now, which are going to be the bigger, more important policies that the coalition takes to the elections, will be more clear, will have costings attached to them. And then there is the formal costings process at the end of the election campaign where everything will be scrutinised. So I guess that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, that this is the point where these things come under more scrutiny, and presumably the coalition will be more prepared for that.
So far, there's been a lot of people saying, we've been very clear about this. And every time they say that, you
They're
think,
not.
like, this sort of suggests that you haven't been all that clear, or that one of your colleagues has said the opposite just not very long ago. It kind of reminds me, I kept thinking about this when I was researching for today, that moment in 2018 when Pauline Hanson stood up in Parliament on talking about the Turnbull's government's business tax cuts and said, I haven't flip-flopped. I said no originally, then I said yes, then I've said no, and I've stuck to it. It's just like, there's not quite that level of flip-flopping going on, but yeah, I don't know, a bit of it.
It depends how you define it. I mean, Jo, you kind of can see why some coalition MPs are getting a bit nervous.
Yeah, that's right. And just to pick up on a point Lenore raised at the beginning, like one of Peter Dutton's great strengths has been that he has really held the coalition together and had a period of, relative stability for an opposition leader. There hasn't been the white anting and backbiting. There hasn't been talks of leadership changes, despite being, a figure of from the right wing of the party who a lot of people had doubts about when he became opposition leader. He's done quite an effective job in holding it together. And it's really only the last few days, the last few weeks, you've started to see a bit of dissent trickling through. A few stories appearing in the media this week of, backbenchers and other MPs a bit nervous about, do we have enough policy to go to an election? Do we have the serious kind of economic policy to answer the questions that Australians are coming up with? Are we ready to present a budget reply of our own? We haven't really seen those types of stories during this term, but I think it says a lot that we're seeing them now.
So out of everything so far that you've talked about, the missteps for Peter Dutton, the recent ones, some of the policy problems, what do you think is really going to stick in voters' minds once they finally get to the polls?
Well, I think it probably won't be the ins and outs of the divestiture of insurance companies, for instance. It's going to be much more impressions that people get from sort of cursory or passing interactions with political messaging. And I think there's a large proportion of the electorate that is quite removed from political messaging now, who get their information in all manner of ways. Not always through the mainstream media and not always through sort of credible sources. So I think it's hard to say at the moment what will stick, and I think it will be a battle of these kind of perceptions a lot more than actual policies. The perception that Anthony Albanese is weak, which is Dutton has been working on for a very long time, and the government's perception, or the perception they're trying to build, that Peter Dutton is reckless and unprepared and not really ready to be Prime Minister. Really, I think for a big chunk of slightly disengaged swinging voters, it will be those kinds of perceptions that make a difference. And a lot of them don't make up their mind until quite close to election day. So,
in the booth sometimes.
Yeah.
Just a kind of superficial impression of him being wrong-footed or not being across the material or not having something to offer when he's asked about it in more detail during the campaign. It's just going to be at that sort of top, for many people anyway, but that sort of somewhat superficial, perceptual level of whether he's strong.
Which probably explains why the coalition is so dead keen for Anthony Albanese to make a dash to Washington to talk to Donald Trump, because anything could happen there, and then that could create a perception. There's lots of things that could happen in a campaign that we can't even predict, which could actually be quite decisive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be silly to think that a few negative stories about Peter Dutton are going to totally turn things around. You know, the polls have been trending in his favour in general, even though there has been a little bit of a pullback. I mean, I think what we have seen, though, is a bit of a slowdown of that momentum that he has. And not only does that potentially plant some negative perceptions in voters' minds, but it also potentially gives Labor a bit of room to talk about the issues they want to talk about if they're not sort of being pursued relentlessly, like by the Dutton Terminator, which is sort of what the summer has felt like. You know, Labor has really tried to get a bit of clear air to talk about Medicare, to talk about the policies they want to, and at every turn, Dutton sort of steamrolls over them and the conversation is back where he wants it. The slight sort of correction we're seeing, rather, I think, than putting Dutton on top, at least might give Labor and the government a little bit of clear air, to talk about their own agenda and reset the campaign to come.
Okay, so a bit of a change of gears. It's time for the story that we can't get out of our heads this week. Lenore.
Well, if I'm honest, it's Trump, but we can't talk about Trump the whole time, so I'm going to go for something lighter, which is a story we ran about a festival, a forthcoming festival in Melbourne called the Rising Festival. One of the events there is called the Space Out competition, which basically involves sitting on your ass doing absolutely nothing. You're not allowed to look at your phone, you're not allowed to fall asleep, you just got to sit there. It was developed, this idea, by a South Korean artist called Whoopi Yang, after she experienced burnout while working in a stressful job. I mean, relatable. I want to go in the Space Out competition. I'm less keen on another one they've got in that festival, which is by a local sound artist in the Melbourne City Bars called Saturate, which is an audio artwork can only be heard underwater in the bathhouse. I think I prefer the sitting down and spacing out one.
It's highly competitive, I read in our story.
The spacing
Yeah,
out. I reckon I'd
with
win.
commentary, whispered commentary from the sidelines. It sounds amazing.
Want to go in it, Mike?
No, I'd be
Oh,
terrible.
come
I'd be
on.
fidgeting and...
Mike, what's yours?
So my story this week is one we ran about, a science story about about blue-lined octopuses, which are a kind of blue-ringed octopus
That's
that
straight
may
up.
be familiar. They sound like quite a nasty piece of work, frankly, as animals go. So the story was that researchers have discovered how they have sex, basically, and what happens is that the male, which is much smaller than the female, and the female's only the size of a golf ball, so they're tiny but very dangerous. The male inject females with venom to kind of immobilize them, because otherwise they might get eaten before they can, mate.
I don't know what to say about that. It's so weird.
It's quite a weird evolutionary trait, which is gone into in some detail in the article. But I mean, at first I thought this is kind of like a metaphor for our times. It's just like,
Is it though?
well, it could
Does
be.
the female octopus survive?
They both die fairly soon after.
Wow.
I mean, after giving
Oh.
birth, obviously, that's the point.
That it's like calls for radical octopus celibacy.
But then I thought, actually, maybe there is a glass half full way of looking at it, which I'm always
Yes.
open to, which is that, like, in evolutionary terms, we're humans, we're not blue-lined octopuses. we could have got a worse deal out of it.
If that's your positive message for the
There's-
week, I feel like things might
we
have
can
gone
still
pretty badly.
we can still
Could
enjoy
be worse. We could be a blue-lined octopus.
can still enjoy sex without being either poisoned or
Eaten.
being in fear of eaten and then dying anyway.
He's hoping.
Yeah.
Jo, you have a tough follow-up, but go for it.
So my story this week is related to the particular pleasure I get out of seeing Australianisms make their way into international news. And this week it was courtesy of Ed Husic, the Labor minister, who responded to the Trump administration's decision to slap tariffs or not give an exemption to Australia from their tariffs on steel and aluminium, which, there was a lot of sort of careful diplomatic language around, but Husic described it as a dog act, which to me is just like peak Australian playground language. And I was thinking it would, the next terms I might like to hear us use in Trump diplomacy were gronk, if someone wanted to call him a gronk, or if someone wanted to use my favourite phrase, which is game on moles, which is
We
Australia's
really
next
have
top
to do an
model.
explainer on
So
that.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to give us a definition on either of this.
I think you have to, you feel
If
it.
you
It's an
know, you
Australian
know.
thing. If you know, you know. A gronk, gronks are as gronks
I think
do.
they should just say, "Well done, champ."
Yeah.
Lenore, Mike, Jo, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Reged.
Thanks, Reged.
Thanks, Reged.